Welcome, everyone. I'm Emily Henkin-Ritter. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, Merced, and I'm the coordinator of online speaker series for the Peace Science Society International. Today is the first session of the spring 2018 online Peace Science Colloquium. And we have an excellent panel today. We're going to hear a presentation from Sara Mitchell, who's professor at the of political science at the University of Iowa, and Andrew Owsiak, who is an associate professor at the University of Georgia. And they're going to be presenting an excellent paper today entitled Judicialization of the Sea, Bargaining Under the UNCLOS regime, UNCLOS regime. We're joined today by four excellent discussants. We have Paul Huth, professor of political science at the University of Maryland, Faten Ghosn, who's an associate professor at the University of Arizona, Melin, who is a professor at Loyola University, and we also have Áslaug Ásgeirsdóttir, who is a professor at Bates College. Thank you so much to all of you for reading the paper and joining us today. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sara and Andy.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for watching our presentation or listening in. So today we're going to talk about a project we've been working on. Really, we're motivated by thinking about the broad increase in the number and influence of international courts, both globally in terms of courts like the International Court of Justice, UNCLOS, the International Criminal Court, but also the rise of regional courts. And so what we want to ask in this paper is, what effect does this increased legalization and judicialization of international politics have on bargaining in international relations? And when two countries agree to a judicialized dispute settlement process, how does that affect the bargaining process under the shadow of that process? And so a lot of research is focused on international courts as conflict managers, but less work has been done to think about how the possibility of going to a court influences out of court or shadow bargaining. So we focus on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and we think this is a hard test case for what we're looking at. First of all, because there have been a lot of diplomatic disagreements over maritime claims, especially since World War II. A lot of these claims have been militarized, so about 1 in 4 of the cases that we analyze have had at least one militarized conflict. The salience is relatively high. We can think of prominent cases like the Spratly Islands or Senkaku, where we're getting lots of engagement, both militarized and peaceful engagement. And we also wanted to study this issue area because the Law of the Sea Convention is arguably the most legalized and judicialized dispute settlement procedure that's ever been created, or one of the most legalized processes. So we think it's an interesting case. In the paper, we go through some of the literature talking about kind of the debate in the literature about, do courts matter, yes or no, the optimists and the pessimists. We also note that this same kind of debate played out in the literature when the Law of the Sea Convention came about. So some people were concerned about the creation of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, or ITLOS, because there was a fear that it would compete with the International Court of Justice or other regional courts like the European Court of Justice. But on the plus side, there was a feeling that ITLOS would be able to attract judges with expertise that could hear the cases and do a good job settling the points of disagreement. Now, I have a quote here from Charney where he talks about the idea that if the dispute settlement system worked well, then you would never have to go to court. So just like in cases of divorce, if a husband and wife seeking to get a divorce have the possibility of going to an international court or to a domestic court to settle their disagreement, then they should be able to reach a settlement out of court. And this is the kind of selection effect that we are focused on in this paper. So looking at cases that could go to court but don't go to court. Now, we focus, like I said, on the Law of the Sea Convention, and it's a really interesting body to study because it has a very specific procedures for conflict management when countries have maritime disputes. So there's a series of articles that specify peaceful dispute settlement, not using militarized tools of settlement. We also focus on Article 287 in the treaty, which is interesting because countries can select what binding forum they go to if they go to adjudication or arbitration. And so under Article 287, countries can select between the UNCLOS, the ICJ, and one of two arbitration procedures. Arbitration under Annex 7 is the default procedure if countries do not make an official Article 287 declaration. These are optional declarations, so only 27% of ratifying UNCLOS members have made these declarations. On the other hand, 91% of countries have ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, so the legalization, as we call it, is very high under the treaty, but this is extra step of recognizing an international court for specific settlement is less common. Countries can also exclude maritime boundaries or cases relating to military matters under Article 298. That was something that China used against the Philippines in the most recent Permanent Court of Arbitration case. Okay, so in the paper we develop, kind of think about countries bargaining over a maritime area, and we think about, first of all, what would happen if they did not have any courts or institutions? How would they settle a dispute? The example we give in the paper is the US and Canada having a disagreement over the extension of the AB line, which was the land boundary in the Alaska Boundary Tribunal, and they have a disagreement over where that line extends into the ocean. And so they can use a variety of tools to settle that. And in fact, we have seen in this case, there was a militarized conflict between US Coast Guard and Canadian fishing vessels, but there have also been several bilateral negotiations between the two sides. And the US and Canada have also used binding settlement, like in the Gulf of Maine case involving the ICJ. Now, in these cases, when you don't have institutional rules, what you typically do is rely on customary law. So traditionally, countries claimed three nautical miles territorial sea area, and that came from the custom of being the distance at which cannons could fire from land offshore. Now, the next thing you could imagine is, what if you negotiate a maritime dispute, but you do so in the context of an institution that provides legalization? So in this case, you have some kind of obligations that, rules and norms that you are expected to follow. These are precise, there's precision to those rules, and you also have some kind of delegation to third parties in the case that you have to settle a disagreement under that institution. Now, the Law of the Sea Convention offers a lot of guidelines for countries' claims. So the territorial sea limits, contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zones, continental shelf claims. So all of these things are articulated under the treaty. So we think that because the treaty specifies these rules clearly, it should reduce the onset of new diplomatic disagreements over maritime areas. We also think, though, that because the dispute settlement part of the treaty has a lot of clarity in terms of how the procedures you would use to settle a dispute, that we will also see fewer militarized conflicts between UNCLOS members, and that they will use more peaceful settlement tools to settle existing maritime disputes. Now, the third element that we add is what we call judicialization. And so this is the idea that international courts play an additional role in the way that that help to clarify the claims that states can make and the expectations of what will happen if they take those claims to an international court. So in the paper, we provide a list of cases in which the several prominent international courts or arbitration bodies have heard cases related to maritime disputes. And we give some examples where these courts have established precedents in their decisions. So in the continental shelf cases, for example, the ICJ sided with Germany's claim for equity over the principle of equidistance, which had been established in the continental shelf agreement prior to that judgment. So we argue that when countries make Article 287 declarations where they specify which judicial body they want to go to, that this is an additional signal that is sent in the bargaining process. And so going to international courts is costly, and countries can pay audience costs for failure, for losing on a salient issue. And these standing courts also have judges and rules that are in place. So we think that when you make this additional joint 287 declaration, what this says is that, first of all, you're willing to go to a judicial settlement if you cannot come to an agreement outside of court, but also that it reaffirms your recognition of the legalized process of the Law of the Sea Convention. So we think that this additional step of judicialization helps to reduce the onset of maritime claims and the chances for militarized conflict between Law of the Sea Convention members. Now, to test this claim, we take some existing papers that have already been established to look at maritime claim onset, maritime claim settlement in terms of militarized or peaceful settlement, and then we bring in several variables to test our key claims. First of all, we have both the monadic and dyadic measures of the Law of the Sea Convention commitment. So this is the legalization part of our argument. So we look at signature and ratification of UNCLOS for countries. And then we also have a systemic measure where UNCLOS is either the period after signature, 82 and beyond, and then the period when it came into force in 1994. And then we code from the UN website countries' Article 287 declarations, and then we come up with a series of variables to capture the joint declarations. We've also tried coding these both monadically and dyadically. I'm just going to focus here on the dyadic commitment, so where both parties, for example, recognize the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea as a preferred outcome. Countries can rank order these outcomes. So in this graph, you can see that Spain, for example, ranks ITLOS and the ICJ as both at number 1. Other countries like Germany have a rank ordering where ITLOS is preferred to the other 2 forums. But this is the coding that we're using to create the key variables in our analysis. So first of all, we look at, do UNCLOS members avoid new maritime conflicts with each other if they have ratified the convention and if they've made these additional judicialization claims or declarations. And so here we find that you can see that signature and ratification reduce the chances for militarized conflict in a pair of countries. We see a further reduction after 1982 at the systemic level. In terms of the specific declarations, we find that the recognition of the Law of the Sea Tribunal, or the ITLOS court, does reduce militarized conflict, as does one of the 2 annex procedures, which in this case is Annex 8. On the other hand, a couple of the other judicialization declarations do not have a reduction for new maritime claims. Secondly, we look at militarized force. So we look to see, does making a legalized or a judicialized commitment affect the militarization of maritime conflicts? Here we see that ratification reduces the propensity for, this is MIDs in general, and then we see a reduction at the system level as well. Several, or at least 2 of the Article 287 declarations also reduce the chances for MID, with the exception of the ICJ joint declaration sees a positive propensity for militarized conflict, which is contrary to our expectation. We also then look at just the ICAO maritime claim data. And so here we're focused on any ongoing year of a maritime conflict. And here you can see that there is no direct relationship here between UNCLOS signature ratification and peaceful settlement in maritime claims. On the other hand, post 1982, we have seen an increase in general in peaceful settlements. And then we also see countries that have recognized multiple forums under the 287. So a country like Germany or Spain, those countries are more likely to engage in peaceful settlement attempts to resolve their maritime conflicts, and that's consistent with our theoretical expectation. And we also see that our Annex 7 procedure also increases the propensity for peaceful settlement. We find that we also look at the types of settlement strategies in Table 5 in the paper, and we find that, first of all, countries that recognize multiple forums, so like I said, a country like Spain or Germany that recognizes multiple courts or arbitration panels, those countries tend to engage in more bilateral negotiations. We also see that if countries accept the default Annex 7 procedure, then they tend to turn to non-binding forms of conflict management, so things like mediation or good offices. Interestingly, we found that recognizing the same judicial forum, so if two countries both recognize the ITLOS court as their preferred forum, then they never end up in court. So this is a perfect predictor, right, of not going to court, is that these two countries accepted the jurisdiction. So in this case, recognition of the court fits with our theory because countries don't ever have to go to court because they use these tools of bilateral negotiation and non-binding conflict management. We also look at whether these same UNCLOS commitments affect another issue, correlates of war issue. We look at territorial claims just to confirm that what we're looking at is in fact that these legal and judicial commitments in the area of maritime law really matter. And so our variables do not predict conflict management for territorial claims. And that's a confirmation for us that we are capturing something unique and interesting in the arena of maritime conflict. We also looked at when cases have gone to court, have parties had these declarations in place. And we do find that when cases end up in court, typically, it's one country is often made a declaration to recognize that forum. Like I said, if both countries recognize the same forum, those tend to not go to court. But in a lot of these cases, we do find that if they end up taking a maritime dispute to adjudication or arbitration, that they do end up in the preferred forum that they laid out under the Article 287 declaration. So this again confirms to us that countries are treating these declarations for judicialization seriously. So I think we've shown in the paper that UNCLOS dispute settlement procedures influence the way that countries bargain over maritime issues. And while a lot of people have looked at the legalization of the law of the sea convention and countries' signature and ratification of UNCLOS, I think what our paper adds is a new element focused on the judicialization of states' commitments under UNCLOS. And in particular, we show that Article 287 declarations, which only about 27% of UNCLOS members have used, that those send an additional signal recognizing the legitimacy of going to a court or an arbitration panel in the event that you cannot settle out of court. We also, in the appendix to the paper, separate the analyses in the 1982 to 1993 and then 1994 to 2001 periods, and we do that to show that there is a strengthening of the judicialization mechanism when the Law of the Sea Convention comes into force. And if you look at those results, you will see that they confirm our theory that in the period when the treaty comes into legal force, we get stronger results for the Article 287 variables in terms of how countries use peaceful settlement or avoid militarized conflict. We also, in the future, we're interested in looking at success rates for negotiation. So in this paper, we're just looking at whether countries are using negotiations, but we don't look at whether that helps them to reach agreements or whether they carry out those agreements. And we also are interested in testing this in a different area of judicialization. So we picked a pretty high level of judicialization area, but it would be interesting to contrast what we've done in an area that has maybe river conflicts, for example, have been institutionalized, but have not been judicialized in the same way that maritime disputes have. So I think I will end there.
Thank you, Sarah. And we can open it up for comments or questions to anyone who'd like to start.
I'll go ahead, I guess.
Okay, fun.
Hi, Sarah, Andy, how are you guys?
Good.
So I enjoyed reading the paper, and some of the question I really have come from on the kind of data and research side, because I thought you guys laid out a good job in terms of explaining. I really like some of the analogies that you used opening up. So my first thing is, how many maritime claims had been resolved by the time that some of your analyses are kicking in terms of when the UNCLOS was signed and then ratified? Because I was trying to imagine, what does that pool look like of potential, right? I know you guys have politically relevant dyads here, but what is that potential of countries who still have a possibility of having a maritime issues, right? So if up to this point, if countries had resolved their maritime, then really they don't have, unless they have something new. I don't know, I'm not familiar with the data. So this is why it would be important to know what's the possible pool of possible claims, and how many countries who ended up signing and ratifying the agreement had previous claims that were already resolved. So do these people feel comfortable signing because they have already settled, or are they now all of a sudden wanted to use this? So I think just having a little bit more of explanation about the history of the claims up until that point would be a little bit helpful. So I'll just start with that for now.
Sarah, you want to respond?
So one thing that we do in the paper is talk about, we do try to deal with kind of a potential question of endogeneity. So is it that countries that settled their maritime disputes then recognize UNCLOS as a legitimate institution? We find in looking at that sequencing that that's not typically what's going on. Countries do have a lot of ongoing disputes when they join UNCLOS, and they start quite a few new disputes. So it's not that they're preventing all maritime disputes. Just to give you an example, like China has, I think, 6 ongoing maritime conflicts in our data set today, even though they're a ratifying member of the Law of the Sea Convention. So, what we're saying though is that the probability that China would start new maritime conflicts does diminish especially after the period of 94 forward. So it's not that there are no maritime conflicts. There are quite a few that are ongoing. It's just that the baseline probability that you will start a new one of these diplomatic conflicts is reduced.
It looks like, I'm sorry, go ahead, Faten.
No, I was just going to say that I think it would be a little bit to help the reader, because I did look at the appendix as well, and it was hard for me to understand, kind of like, again, because I'm not familiar. I'm coming at this was the first time I read any of this about the laws of sea. Mm-hmm. So excuse my ignorance on that. But it was apparent that I noticed that even though the ones that ratified, right, if you look at the countries that had ranked, you had 63% of them on the ITLOS come from two regions, Latin America and Europe. And the same thing, you know, if you're thinking about the ICJ, they come again from Latin America and from Europe. So I didn't understand the difference between just ratifying and then ranking, because and so could you guys just explain it? And it would be helpful, I think, for a reader who's not familiar, what does that really mean for your data?
You mean, what does the ranking under Article 287 mean?
So some had ratified but hadn't ranked, right? And then some, and then.
Okay, so the 287 is an optional declaration. So member states do not have to make it. That's why I was saying only about 27% of countries who have ratified the convention have made this additional declaration. So if you do not make a declaration, then arbitration becomes a default procedure. If you make a declaration, then you specify which forum you find acceptable, and then also you have the option to rank order them. Okay. So you can see that if a country ranked ICJ and ITLOS both as number one, that would tell you that they are equally accepting of a case going to either the International Court of Justice or the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. If they have a rank ordering like Germany does, then it says that its most preferred forum is the ITLOS court, followed by the arbitration and then ICJ. So in that case, if two countries that had preferred forums met in a dispute, then if both of them recognize, say, the ITLOS as their number one preferred forum, then they would go to that court. That's why we try to look at some of the cases to see if they actually end up, countries that make those declarations end up using those bodies. And we do find that typically at least one of the countries in a court case has in fact recognized that forum as one of their preferred options.
I think the reason I'm asking this is because it's linked to just the two regions that I found that were the dominant ones, right? It was Latin America and Europe. And so I was wondering if you guys think there's anything going on here with the data, especially since you find the opposite of what you expected on the joint ICJ 287 declaration.
Sara, before you answer, Áslaug has a two finger, and so does Molly.
Okay.
So I actually want to sort of echo that. I would like actually thank you for having me read this. It was really interesting, and I'm so excited that like judicialization matters. And like I come at this literature from an international political economy perspective more and more, so or in general. So I found the paper actually quite exciting for that. But I do think that to build on this last point is that there's what is missing, I think, in the actual is sort of better definition of like what actually constitutes a maritime claim. And also like the number of them over time. I was sort of thinking maybe a graph sort of that gives the reader an idea of like how many claims are we talking about every year, like as the N, versus sort of how many things that go through a judicial process. Because I think there's going to be a huge difference from what I know actually of the law of the sea and claims. The second question I have, and this is sort of a more kind of the types of conflict that you see, is that in a paper that Martin Steinwand and I published fairly recently, was that we sort of found in maritime boundary settlements that the type of resources really mattered in how conflicts were settled. So if you have oil in the area, you're much more likely to negotiate a maritime boundary than if you have, for example, conflict over fisheries resources. So you actually end up with a different type of a conflict, like you have a different sort of set of solutions available to you and preferences over what you want to do, depending on what type of a conflict you have. Do you have any evidence of sort of that? Because you just sort of talk about maritime claims and you sort of don't really sort of talk about what type of claims are predominant.
So what we're talking about is, this is the issue correlates of war data. So it's any claim by official representatives of two or more governments over the ownership or access to a maritime area. And so the most typical conflicts in the data are the drawing of EEZ boundaries is very common. Access to fishing, so the Canada-Spanish case is one where Spanish fishermen want access but don't get it. Recognition of making a claim on the basis of a rock, which is claimed as an island rather than a rock. So something like Aves Island. But those are some of the types of cases that enter the data. But yeah, it's basically it's anytime we have evidence that two or more governments have made official statements that are in disagreement with each other about who owns or has access to a maritime area.
So what is the range like per year in terms of like claims in the world? I
don't have the plot. I was going to pull this up here. I can give you the regional breakdown.
But I think that would be sort of good to have kind of in the there it is. Okay.
Let's see. So you can see here. This is from my paper with Paul Hensel.
Yeah.
So you can see there's 267 maritime claims globally.
Okay.
So that's the regional breakdown. In terms of the temporal frequency, they really rise after the Truman Declaration, following World War II. And then while land border disputes tend to decline in our data since World War II, maritime conflicts have increased over time. Although, like I said, after 94, they start to drop back down. But I agree that adding a graph of the number of ongoing claims would be something that would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Molly?
Yeah, I had kind of a similar thought as Faten in terms of kind of wondering about the numbers, but from a different perspective. So wondering if the court's doing its job and these treaties are doing their jobs, shouldn't there be kind of fewer cases across time that can be unsettled? So if the court's actually clarifying what borders look like, are there kind of fewer opportunities for them in the future to have borders that they need to decide about? So I don't know. It seemed like you guys tried to get at that a little bit with some of your control variables, but I'm not totally convinced that you do that there. So I'd be interested to hear how you think about that. And then to Faten's other point, I wonder if you guys could use some of Amelia's stuff on like whether different cultures are more susceptible to kind of the international judicialization and legalization, if we're seeing such trends in terms of which regions are using the courts.
Yeah, we haven't done the kind of regional breakdown. I have another paper with Amelia that looks at what countries make Article 287 declarations, or what factors affect what forums they like. And consistent with our previous work, we find that countries that have civil legal systems prefer the ICJ over other forums. So that, and in our other work, we show that civil law countries, because of their affinity with Roman law tradition and rules, that they prefer the ICJ. So we do find that civil law countries prefer ICJ, common law countries prefer ITLOS, major powers don't like any courts, which is consistent with, kind of Posner and Yu's point about major powers issuing, tying their hands.
Did you want to answer her other point about whether settling borders means that you have fewer borders to settle in the future?
Yeah, again, I think it'll be. I think we can definitely add a graph of maritime claims. It does, like I said, it should be dropping globally. I haven't updated it, but my guess is that it will rise and then drop over time. So it's kind of what land claim. We also see a similar time series where as countries become independent, they contest a lot of their land borders. And then once those are settled, you get a drop off in territorial claim frequency. So I would expect, especially after 82, and then even more so after 94, that the number of new claims that's starting, the propensity for new claims is dropping. But I haven't normalized that data by, Andy and I haven't done anything with like number of countries that could have claims. And that's something that Paul Hensel has done with the territorial claim data. I think that we would have to do something like that to account for how many countries could have claims or something like that.
Paul, you're up next.
Thank you. I have a couple of comments to start with, and then I have others, but I'll sort of wait and try and come back in to give everybody else a chance to offer comments as well. So my first comment would be it's about the framing of the paper, and it would be that I think you framed the paper too much around judicialization as opposed to the legalization, because as you note, most states don't choose courts, don't go down the path of choosing particular courts for compulsory dispute settlement. So that's a minority of states actually are very clear about their preference for that. And then you noted that on at least maritime boundary issues, states can opt out of compulsory judicialization. So to me, legalization through UNCLOS is quite important, potentially developing legal focal points around what legal principles exist and their clarity for settling a range of maritime claims. And so I would give a little more attention to legalization being a very important feature of UNCLOS as opposed to the judicialization that comes out of UNCLOS. Related then, I would have liked to have seen more discussion of what are the actual principles in UNCLOS that deal with maritime delimitation and how clear those legal principles are in establishing what I would think of as a legal focal point. I'm not an expert in this area at all, so my comments may be off the mark, but my rough understanding is that equidistance has been firmly established and clarified by UNCLOS as a very central legal principle for settling the maritime boundary claims. But there's also this reference to equity as another important legal principle for settling maritime boundary claims. And my rough understanding is that equity as a legal principle is far less clear about what it implies. And as a result, equidistance and the baselines, and that has all been clarified quite a bit by UNCLOS as I understand it. But this lingering, well, equity needs to be considered, opens up legal uncertainty in my mind about UNCLOS. And that gives an opening to states, from my vantage point, to pursue disputes and make claims, even when some of the legal principles are quite clear, but the equity gives them an opening to pursue claims and disputes because there's legal uncertainty. And they might be able to make the case or try to make the case on equity grounds, which is quite, I think, uncertain whether that'll work or not, but it's worth trying in many cases. So that's sort of my opening comments. I have other comments that I can come back to, but those are my first two that I wanted to put on the table.
Sara.
Yeah, I think good points there. So I think you're right that the principles of where you're, what are the distances for the boundaries. There's been a lot of legal clarification about the treatment of baselines and how they're established. Yes, equidistance and equity have appeared in both the law, the Sea Convention regime, and in court cases. But I think there are still conflicts still arise for many reasons. One has to do with where you have overlapping EEZs. The drawing of where that boundary is. Those cases often do take into account equity, equity and division of resources principles in a way that we might not see in other types of cases. In the Spratly Island case, China is trying to use a historical basis for the claim So if they actually went by UNCLOS's rules, they would not have any, their 200-mile EEZ does not reach where they're claiming in the Spratly area. So they're using a basis of, you know, their fishermen have been fishing in this area for thousands of years. They build up of artificial islands is another attempt by both Vietnam and China and other states to have put military installations on these islands. So that kind of harkens back to the idea of effective occupation and territorial claims. So I think while the Law of the Sea Convention has very explicit rules about what states' claims are, the reason that we still have a lot of diplomatic disagreement is because if these claims overlap, we still have to have an agreement about where we'll draw the boundary. If fish move across the boundaries, like we see in a lot of cases, we get more militarized conflict in situations where there's migratory fish stocks. As Áslaug said, we also see in the ICAO data that where there's potential for oil exploration, we get more militarization in the period of potential exploration rather than once they've started drilling oil out of the area. So I think, so there are still resource bases for the claims, but we can do more in the paper to talk about sort of what are the rules for delimitation, and then why are there all of these uncertainties that remain and form the basis for a lot of the cases that we have in our data set.
Molly.
Yeah, I also was kind of thinking about the legalization aspect a little bit more in terms of how you capture the broader impacts in terms of like a system-wide impact of the treaty. And so I was thinking, because you have a lot more information than I think you use. So you have like when each country is signing the treaty and when they ratify it as, and I was thinking you might be able to build some kind of measure that looks at this kind of global systemic pressure, if you will, on what percentage of countries or something like that has actually signed in a given year. And so are we seeing this kind of international norm that's forming around the way states think about maritime claims? And maybe as more and more countries sign on, do we see kind of a shift that's overtaken there? I was also thinking you might be able to capture other elements of time, like how long countries have been members or how many years since they've ratified. So all this seems pretty easy to capture with the information that you already have, but it's just something you might want to build into the model and might actually be measuring what you're talking about a little bit more directly.
I think going back to the legalization versus judicialization question, I think legalization is important, but in this particular case, 91% of countries have ratified this convention. So it's, one of the most universally recognized treaties in the world. So it doesn't give us as much variation on the legalization dimension as other types of commitments. It's like the ICJ is only accepted by, its jurisdiction is accepted only by about a third of countries, as you know. I think that's one reason why the focus on judicialization, we think, is adding something, because among the 91% of countries that have ratified the Law of the Sea Convention, there's a lot of variation in which ones make these optional declarations, accepting courts as, and particular courts as the forum that they want to settle disputes in. So kind of going back to Paul's earlier question, that's why we think that, that's why we kind of focused our theory on not only legalization, but also judicialization, because we think courts in this particular issue area do play an important role in terms of settling, creating focal points in the law, as you noted, but also they have this shadow effect on countries that recognize the legitimacy of these judicial forums.
Paul had a two-finger on that.
Just a small reaction to one of Sarah's points. I wouldn't equate widespread signature to UNCLOS with clarifying how strong and clear legalization is. to me, the legalization question centers on how clear the legal principles within UNCLOS are. And on delimitation, my concern is that equity is not a very clear legal principle. And as a result, that sort of mitigates or cuts against some of the clarity on the legal dimension.
Okay.
Before you respond, Áslaug?
Well, can I just speak to Paul's point, sort of in a way, like that I know sort of from my research, that is that the law of the sea itself, the treaty is pretty uncertain and unclear about what actually they want the countries to do. But the 1969 case that you guys reference in your paper basically said in response to Germany's claim against Denmark and the Netherlands that, yeah, equidistance is nice and all, but you really have to consider equity. And my understanding of the legal literature post that, sort of the delving in the cases, is that the courts have refused to actually define what equity means. They just they leave that up to countries in a way.
Mm-hmm.
That to me is a big legally that introduces a lot of uncertainty when we talk about the shadow of the law. If equity can be invoked by parties to the dispute, mm-hmm. but what equity legally means, the expectations about it, I think, are uncertain.
I mean, I agree with you, but I think some of the cases, they're more clear cut. So Ecuador, Peru, and Chile claiming 200 nautical mile territorial sea area, I mean, that's just in going against the convention. So, so we have cases in the data, right, where countries are challenging other countries' claims because they're not actually following the rules of the law of the sea convention. So, so yeah, I mean, I agree with you that there are certainly a lot of areas of the convention doesn't settle all of these legal uncertainties, but I think there are still quite a few cases where countries are just in non-compliance with the existing rules. Like it will be interesting to watch the Spratley case because going forward, because the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled that artificial islands cannot be used as a basis for maritime claims, and so we'll see like how that affects. So on the one hand, if we're right, then this PCA ruling should reduce countries' incentives to build up artificial islands going forward, because if the law matters, then these countries will actually be constrained by this. If we're wrong, then it's just going to be, we're just going to keep seeing a doubling down, I guess, of artificial island building. But that would be the idea, is that the court's judgment or ruling in this case would set the precedent for how countries would make claims in this area of maritime law that does have some uncertainty. So that's kind of our idea, that when the courts render judgments, they also have an important role in terms of clarifying, you know, the focal points and addressing some of these legal ambiguities.
I have an open queue. Oh, Áslaug, and then Faten.
Since this is sort of, I think my last point is that one of the things that, and I sort of had a long conversation with sort of legal scholars in Europe recently about the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and they are sort of, and in sort of the way we talk about it, we always talk about it as a court, but what they basically do is they have a list of people that you can pick from, and so countries have pretty much complete control over who hears their cases. And so I wonder, sort of in changing the language in your paper, in sort of moving it away from it, implying that it is an actual court, but it's sort of like a clearinghouse for arbitrators, essentially, I think would be helpful.
I think we had more of that in an earlier version. We had like an earlier section that clarified the distinction between arbitration and adjudication.
I didn't realize like how sensitive international lawyers are to this. Apparently, they just like it sets their hair on fire, basically.
Yeah, we had an earlier version of the paper where we talked about kind of the Posner and you idea that powerful states prefer arbitration because they can set the compromise, they can have influence over what judges are on the panel. So yeah, so we had more of that language in the earlier draft, but yeah, some of that got cut, but we can certainly make sure that
I think a footnote would be enough.
Yeah, footnote that we're treating them both as binding forms of,
yeah,
you know.
Yeah, but they do have, and also to a certain extent in UNCLOS, the states have a pretty significant say in who actually hears, who are members of the legal teams on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, at least for our case, it makes some sense because Article 287 treats the arbitration and court forum as being within the same article. So, but we can, I think that's a good point to clarify that they do have different procedures.
Yeah. Faten.
So just 2 points. One is, did you guys take a look at like the dyads, whether or not they had any other types of claims and issues, not just maritime? Did you, in terms of the history of the countries? And the second, I'm really interested in what you guys think about what's happening in the, you're finding the joint ICJ declaration. I mean, why does it increase? I mean, why does it, it's not working as you expected? Just in terms of just your mind and thought process about what's going on, because I got hung up on that and I go back to it, especially. And so I'm just curious more than anything about what do you think is happening there?
Well, I can say that it confirms a finding that Amelia and I had in our book, where we found the same pattern, that if countries jointly accept the ICJ, they have a higher baseline risk for militarized conflict. So, I don't know if I have a great explanation for why. I did a paper that I never published. It was like one of these working papers. So I did a kind of a process tracing. So I had a territorial claim, then joined the ICJ, then started a territorial claim. And even when I did that process tracing, I still found the same pattern, that after countries joined the ICJ, they had a higher propensity to have disputes. So, I mean, now one explanation that you could get from something like the Volge and Fawcett argument is that when you're in an international organization, you have more opportunities for dispute settlement. So you have the space to have more lower level conflicts. It doesn't explain why you're militarizing things at a higher rate, but I could see that countries that have, they join these big regional or global institutions, and it gives them more opportunities to try to settle some of their disputes. But
Molly has a two-finger.
Yeah, just kind of related to your process tracing that you were talking about. I was wondering if you guys had looked at all at what kind of experience the countries have had with the courts in the past. So we talk a lot about trajectory and stuff like that in the conflict management literature, and I wonder if it works the same way, or if you're seeing things play out similarly in terms of like a learning process happening there.
Yeah, I mean, Powell and Wiegand find that if you've had a win with a court in the past, then you're more likely to go back to that court. So I would expect that if the countries in our data that are preferring the ICJ, these are probably countries that have had wins with the ICJ. So, or it's very likely that they've had wins. So, so that's something that we do have the data on the court cases, so we could add whether they've at least gone, and we could code whether they've gone to that body before. And then I don't know if I fully have all the data on who's won and lost each case, but we could probably put that together, because I think you're right that your success rate with the institution should affect your willingness to use it.
Faten, did you have another point that I cut you off from?
No, it was just that if you guys had looked at the history of other claims, even though they're not maritime.
Oh, right. No, we did. I think I mentioned we took our variables and we used them to try to predict management of territorial claims. Yeah. And none of those are significant. So that at least confirmed that it's something about, the commitments under maritime law that are relevant for how you handle maritime conflicts. But we did not code, do you have other ICAO issues?
Because I'm just thinking about the history of the relationship, especially when I'm thinking about mid-onset, right? So it's less so in terms of the new maritime claim, but more in the mid-onset, if there's other things that are affecting your relationship there. So
I don't remember, Andy, did we ever have a history of conflict measure?
I don't. Did I turn it on now? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think we did in the models that we've done so far, and mostly it was. I think we were trying to isolate the maritime, but you're right that it's possible that these things carry over. My sense is that there's a sequencing pattern where they figure out the land stuff before they figure out the maritime. And that's mostly because in order to solve the maritime, they often need the baseline, and the baseline will come off the land border or something similar. So that kind of aligns with what we see in the sense that like a lot of the Latin American borders settled prior to 1945, a large chunk of them. There's a wave in the 1920s and 30s. And so I think we would not find both ongoing at the same time for most cases, but there certainly are cases where that is true.
Yeah, and Cameron Tees and I, when we wrote the paper on issue rivalry, we found that militarization of the first territorial claim is a strong predictor of having maritime and river claims later in your relationship. So, so it's not just that even that you had territorial claim. It's if you used, if you had a severe, a war or a fatal mid for that earlier land border dispute, then you get a higher density of diplomatic disagreement over lots of issues. So,
yeah, just on those, I think you should include whether the countries are in a territorial dispute, because as Andy said, sometimes it actually implicates the maritime boundary. And then secondly,
yeah, we have that as a variable in the maritime data, is whether there's a territorial claim that's associated with the case. So that's really easy to include.
And then in the equation where you're testing for mid onset, again, a territorial dispute would probably be I would think it would be correlated with mid onset. And since your DV isn't a mid onset over maritime claims per se, you don't know that, it's just a mid onset, you probably need to control for territorial disputes.
We run the model both ways. So we do a general politically relevant dyad analysis, and then the second analysis is just focused on maritime claims, and those are mids are only matched to those diplomatic cases. So we do not include mids over that are not related to the maritime claim. And I think we're getting pretty consistent pattern in those two subsets of results. So
good. Mm-hmm. I could make a comment about politically relevant dyads.
Yeah, go ahead. Maybe we don't want to hear it, but go for it.
That was going to be my other comment. For several of the tests, you use politically relevant dyads, and that seems problematic to me in that conceptually you would want your universe of observations to consist of countries that potentially could have overlapping maritime boundaries or claims. And I'm thinking that there must be quite a few politically relevant dyads that cannot, geographically, physically, cannot have overlapping maritime boundaries or claims, and therefore it would be, I mean, they're not relevant in some sense to the analysis that you're focused on.
Yes, I agree with you, but the problem is getting good time series data on that. So, we use the Jane's volume, it has really good data on who has potentially overlapping EEZs, but that's like at one point in time. So we would have to do more to track, especially as, some of our cases are colonial, like the Juan de Fuca Strait area, that was a British U.S. case that became a Canada-U.S. case. So we'd have to think about how to handle colonial areas and thinking about potential boundaries. But yeah, the data that we used there came from a paper that Hoon Lee and I did where we looked at issue claim onset. And so we were just trying to come up with what's kind of like a broad way we could think about whether countries have diplomatic conflicts. And so we used the politically relevant dyad, but I agree, it's not perfect. For river cases, Paul Hensel and Merritt Grossman have used whether you share the same river basin, for example. So that it would be better if we could come up with a measure for maritime conflict where we had this kind of potential set. What gets tricky is that you have these really giant fishing fleets like Taiwanese fleets that go all over the world. So you can have a dispute between Taiwan and Argentina. That's one of our cases because Argentina tried to prevent Taiwanese vessels from processing their fish in their ports. So those are the kind of cases that we would miss with a politically relevant dyad coding. But
offline, I'm serving on a dissertation from somebody at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and this person has put together a database of potentially overlapping maritime.
Oh, who's that?
I'll do it offline.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds really good.
It might be helpful to you in contact with this person.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, do we have any more comments that anyone would like to bring up to Sara and Andy, or any questions Sara and Andy might have for the panel? Paul.
Just one last one. I think you guys should strengthen your statement of contributions on the shadow of courts, in the sense that you should tell us in more detail what we know about the shadow of courts beyond what research on the WTO or on the ICC, which are relevant literatures on the shadow of courts and some findings there. Just so you can I think you want to elaborate on your claim about the contributions you're making by situating your findings relative to some of those two adjacent areas of work.
Yeah, that's something we had in the longer version of the paper that we had to take out. But we had a whole section comparing to exactly those areas that have looked at bargaining in the shadow. This is like, journals put limits on us. But no, we can try to bring some of that back in.
Nothing's more important than the contribution, right? Like, that's the one that's going to convince them to publish it. If there's anything that you cut, it's not that. Andy?
I was just going to say, I think, first of all, thank you. This has been very helpful. I think we're still trying to, I know Paul had mentioned the framing component a little bit. We've been trying to walk the line between judicialization and legalization. The feedback that we got was that the legal people wanted us to include more about the legalization side of things. But it was also a project that was designed around judicialization. And one of the main reasons we like this is because shadow effects, the challenge with shadow effects is you don't know the universe of potential cases. But in the case of maritime claims, we know that's the potential universe of possible maritime court cases. And so we can actually study the claims or the cases that don't go to court by using the maritime claims structure. And I think to me, that's where a lot of the value comes in. I'm still trying to think through, and I have to think through how to track the legalization clarity over time, because that is something that we're very interested in, is how does legalization produce focal points? How does court law produce, case law produce those focal points over time? I'm not sure we've settled on exactly how to measure that specifically over time, but it is something that we're mindful of, and we appreciate that you've given us a number of things to think about here.
I think we could come up with a strength of maritime claim using something akin to what Paul and his colleagues have done. So, yeah, I think it would be a useful kind of parallel data set to have.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. I would like to thank the Peace Science past president, Sara Mitchell, and her co-author, Andy Owsiak, for presenting today. I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you very much for reading the paper and giving great comments today. Very thoughtful to all of you. We are meeting again on March 12th, correct? I think it's March 12th. It's a Monday, same time. And Howard Liu of Duke University is going to be presenting Elite Competition, Local Extraction, and Social Unrest, Understanding Mass Protests in Authoritarian Regimes. So we look forward to that. If anyone watching would like to take a look at this paper from Sara and Andy, it's posted on the online Peace Science Colloquium website, and I'm sure they would be interested in your comments as well, so you could email them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.